48 hours. That's all it takes. 48 hours for a cyclone to shut down the single most important iron ore export corridor on the planet and lock up billions of dollars in cargo that the entire global steel industry is waiting on. And right now, that's exactly what's happening. Western Australia's Pilbara coasts the stretch of red dirt coastline that feeds China's steel mills, Japan's shipyards, and South Korea's industrial base is paralyzed. Ports shuttered, ships at anchor, conveyors silent. And somewhere in that frozen supply chain sits a number that doesn't get discussed on mainstream financial news. Roughly $4 to $6 billion in iron ore export value, stuck every single time a Category 3 or above makes landfall in the wrong zip code. That number doesn't just sit in a spreadsheet in Perth. It moves. It moves into steel prices in Shanghai. It moves into construction costs in Seoul. It moves into infrastructure timelines in every nation on Earth that builds with steel. And it eventually moves into your wallet because nothing gets built without steel. And nothing gets built without the iron ore that comes almost entirely from one narrow patch of coastline in the world's most cyclone-exposed export zone. This channel doesn't take corporate funding, doesn't answer to advertisers, and doesn't have a PR department telling it which stories to soften. If you want analysis that goes where the financial press won't, the structural vulnerabilities, the supply chain math, the geopolitical bets being made right now because of what's happening in Western Australia, subscribe and turn on notifications. This is the kind of analysis you won't find on the evening news. Let's establish exactly where we are. The Pilbara region of Western Australia is responsible for approximately 53% of all global seaborne iron ore trade. Let that sit for a second. More than half of the entire world's traded iron ore, flowing through a handful of ports, Port Hedland, Dampier, Cape Lambert, that sit directly in the cyclone belt of the eastern Indian Ocean. Port Hedland alone handles more bulk tonnage than any other port on Earth. In a typical year, it exports somewhere between 540 and 580 million tons of iron ore. The math on that is staggering. At current spot prices hovering around $95 to $100 per ton, that's roughly $54 to $58 billion in annual export value flowing through a single port-to-port that shuts down completely when a tropical cyclone approaches within 300 kilometers. That's not a design flaw. That's geography. And geography doesn't negotiate. Australia's Bureau of Meteorology categorizes cyclones on a scale from Category 1 to Category 5. A Category 3 generates sustained winds of 125 kilometers per hour. A Category 4 reaches 170. A Category 5, the kind that rewrites coastlines, exceeds 225 kilometers per hour. The Pilbara coast has absorbed all of them. Cyclone Veronica in 2019. Cyclone Damien in 2020, Tropical Cyclone Ilsa in 2023, which made landfall as one of the most intense cyclones ever recorded on the Australian coast, with wind gusts exceeding 290 kilometers per hour. Every single one of those events triggered full port shutdowns. Every one of them disrupted global iron ore supply, and every one of them moved markets. Here's what the financial press covers when a cyclone hits: the initial disruption, the port closure announcement, maybe a one-paragraph note on iron ore futures. Then it moves on. What it doesn't cover, what it almost never covers, is the full anatomy of why this keeps happening, why the structural exposure hasn't been reduced, and who benefits from the supply volatility that comes every cyclone season without fail. That's what we're doing today. Now let's talk about what actually happens during a shutdown, because the official narrative from the mining companies is always remarkably calm. Rio Tinto issues a statement. HAPE files an operational update. Fortescue acknowledges weather-related disruptions. The language is measured, the timelines are vague, and the financial impact is usually framed as temporary and manageable. The operational reality is something different. When a cyclone warning is issued for Port Hedland, the sequence is precise. Ships already loaded are cleared from the berths first. Ships waiting to load are moved to designated anchorage areas offshore, sometimes 30 to 40 vessels sitting at anchor simultaneously, each one carrying 200 to 400,000 tons of ore capacity waiting to be filled. Loading operations cease entirely. Conveyor systems are secured. The rail lines feeding the port from the inland mine sites, some of them stretching 400 kilometers into the Pilbara interior, stop running. Workers are evacuated from offshore infrastructure. The whole system, a machine that runs 24 hours a day, 365 days a year under normal conditions, simply stops. That stoppage has a measurable cost. Rio Tinto has disclosed in past earnings calls that a single week of disrupted Pilbara operations can reduce quarterly shipments by 8 to 10 million tonnes. At $95 per ton spot price, that's $760 million to $950 million in delayed export revenue from one company in 1 week. BP faces equivalent exposure. Fortescue, which has built its entire business model on high-volume Pilbara exports, is arguably the most vulnerable of the three. Its margins depend on throughput, and throughput depends on the port running. When the port doesn't run, the numbers get uncomfortable very quickly. But here's the dimension almost nobody is discussing. The disruption doesn't end when the cyclone passes. It continues. Port infrastructure takes time to inspect and clear. Channels may need resurveying for sediment displacement. Loading equipment needs safety checks. The vessel queue, which can back up to 40 or 50 ships during a prolonged shutdown, takes days to clear even after operations resume. The operational restart is not a switch being flipped. It's a gradual ramp up over 72 to 96 hours that still runs below full capacity while the backlog is absorbed. The total effective disruption from a significant cyclone event is typically not 48 hours. It's closer to 7 to 12 days of reduced throughput once you account for the full restart cycle. Run that math against the export volumes involved, and you're not talking about a manageable weather event. You're talking about a multi-billion-dollar supply shock to the global steel industry, repeated on average 2 to 3 times per cyclone season every single year. Now here's the number that makes the steel industry nervous. China imports approximately 1 billion tons of iron ore per year. Of that, roughly 60%, 660 million tons, comes from Australian sources, the overwhelming majority of it from the Pilbara. China's steel mills don't maintain enormous ore stockpiles. The economics don't support it. Steel mills prefer to run on relatively lean inventories, trusting the supply chain to deliver reliably. That works beautifully when the Pilbara is running at full capacity. It stops working when cyclone season hits. Chinese steel mills typically hold between 25 and 35 days of ore inventory at port. When Australian shipments slow, that buffer starts draining. Within 10 to 15 days of a sustained disruption, mills are making hard choices about production schedules. Within 20 days, some are bidding aggressively on Brazilian ore, higher cost, longer transit just to maintain output. The iron ore spot price moves, steel prices move, and the disruption that started on a coastline in northwest Australia is now showing up in construction project budgets in Guangdong, manufacturing costs in Jiangsu, and infrastructure timelines in countries across Southeast Asia that buy Chinese steel for their own development programs. 660 million tons from one weather-exposed corridor. That's not a supply chain. That's a single point of failure operating at planetary scale. Now let's pull back further, because the cyclone problem is real, but the cyclone problem is also a symptom of something larger, a concentration of critical resource infrastructure that has geopolitical dimensions that go far beyond weather risk. Beijing is not unaware of the Pilbara's vulnerability. China's dependence on Australian iron ore has been a source of strategic discomfort in Beijing for over a decade. The relationship between China and Australia has gone through serious turbulence, the diplomatic freeze of 2020 and 2021, the trade restrictions China imposed on Australian barley, wine, beef, and coal, the targeted tariffs that were clearly designed to pressure Canberra into political compliance. Notice what wasn't targeted. Iron ore was never touched. Not once, during the entire period of heightened trade tensions, did China impose any meaningful restriction on Australian iron ore. And the reason is simple and brutal. China physically cannot replace it. The ore grades coming out of the Pilbara, high iron content, low impurity levels, consistent quality, are not replicated at scale anywhere else on Earth at a price point that makes Chinese steel economically competitive. Brazil's Vale is the only other supplier operating at comparable volume, but Brazilian ore is more expensive. The transit time is longer. And Vale's own operational history includes catastrophic infrastructure failures at Brumadinho and Mariana that rattled global supply confidence. China is locked in. It knows it's locked in. And it's been methodically working on that problem for years. The investments China has made in Guinea's Simandou iron ore deposit, one of the largest undeveloped high-grade ore deposits on the planet, are not primarily commercial decisions. They're strategic hedges. Simandou has been under development discussion for 30 years. The infrastructure requirements are enormous. A railway across difficult terrain, a new deep water port, a supply chain built from scratch in a country with complex governance challenges. The economics have never been clean. But Beijing is pushing it forward anyway, because having an alternative supply corridor, even a partial one, even a more expensive one, reduces the strategic leverage that Australia holds simply by virtue of geographic concentration. Every ton of Simandou ore that eventually reaches Chinese ports is a ton that doesn't have to come through a cyclone exposed berth in Port Hedland. Russia is watching this dynamic with interest. Moscow has its own iron ore resources, primarily in the Kursk region, and has long harbored ambitions of expanding eastward resource trade with China. The war in Ukraine and resulting Western sanctions have accelerated Chinese-Russian resource discussions across multiple commodity categories. Iron ore is on the table. The volumes aren't competitive with Australia, yet not even close, but the political alignment is there, and the long-term investment interest is being expressed. The message being sent from Beijing's strategic planning apparatus is not subtle. Australian iron ore dependence is a vulnerability to be reduced, not a partnership to be deepened. And every cyclone season that disrupts Pilbara exports reinforces that message. Now here's the part the Australian government doesn't discuss publicly. Western Australia's port infrastructure was designed and built for a different climate baseline. The cyclone intensity and frequency projections being published now by the Australian Bureau of Meteorology and Climate Research Institutions indicate a trend toward more intense peak cyclone events in the eastern Indian Ocean, the precise zone where the Pilbara coast sits. Not necessarily more cyclones in total count, but stronger ones when they do form. Category 4 and 5 events where Category 3 events once occurred. The infrastructure hardening required to maintain operational continuity in a higher intensity cyclone environment is not trivial. Port Hedland's existing storm surge barriers, berth designs, and conveyor systems were engineered to tolerances that made sense when they were built. The question now being asked in quiet conversations between mining engineers, infrastructure investors, and insurance actuaries is whether those tolerances are still adequate and whether the cost of upgrading them has been properly accounted for in the long-term valuations being assigned to Pilbara assets. Insurance premiums on Pilbara port infrastructure have increased substantially over the past 5 years. That's not a coincidence. The insurance industry runs the actuarial math without political interference, and the math is telling a story that the public statements from mining companies are not. The mining companies will tell you infrastructure investment is ongoing, that safety upgrades are continuous, that cyclone preparedness protocols are world-class. All of that may be true, and the operational management of these facilities is genuinely sophisticated. But sophisticated operations management doesn't change the fundamental exposure of having 53% of global seaborne iron ore trade running through ports that close every time the Indian Ocean decides to spin up a significant low-pressure system. That structural exposure is priced into the market's risk calculations. It's just not priced into the way the story is told to the public. Let me show you how the math compounds. A Category 4 cyclone event causing a 10-day effective disruption to Port Hedland operations affects approximately 15 million tons of export throughput, taking the annual run rate and applying the shutdown and restart cycle. At $95 per ton, that's $4 billion in delayed shipment value from Port Hedland alone. Add BHP's Dampier operations and Fortescue's Anderson Point terminal facing the same weather system, and the combined throughput impact approaches 25 to 30 million tons. That's 4 to 2. $9 billion in delayed iron ore export value from a single significant cyclone event. Now multiply that across a cyclone season. The Pilbara averages 2 to 3 meaningful tropical cyclone disruptions per season. The season runs from November through April. Some years are worse, 2019 saw multiple consecutive significant events. Some are lighter, but the structural average is clear. Every year, this corridor loses somewhere between $6 and $10 billion in export throughput value to cyclone disruption. $6 to $10 billion every year, reliably, predictably, built into the system. That's not weather risk. At that scale, at that regularity, that's a structural tax on global steel supply, and every buyer of Australian iron ore, most prominently China, pays it through supply uncertainty, price volatility, and the cost of maintaining buffer inventory to cover the disruption windows. Here are my 3 predictions, with timelines attached. First, within the next 5 years, at least one major mining company will announce a formal infrastructure hardening program specifically framed around cyclone intensity escalation rather than standard maintenance. The insurance mathematics will force the disclosure that the current structures are operating outside their original design tolerances in an evolving climate environment. Expect Rio Tinto or BHP to lead this, and expect the market reaction to be a quiet reassessment of long-term Pilbara asset values. Second, Simandou ore will reach Chinese ports within 4 years. When it does, it will be framed as a commercial development. It is actually the first meaningful structural reduction in Australia's leverage over Chinese steel production. The timing will not be coincidental with cyclone season disruptions. Beijing's infrastructure planners are not sentimental. Third, within the next 18 months, we will see a significant cyclone event cause enough sustained disruption to the Pilbara corridor that iron ore spot prices spike above $120 per ton for a period of at least 3 weeks. When that happens, watch which countries start accelerating their own steel production capacity investments. The supply shock will be presented as a weather story. The correct framing is a structural vulnerability story that's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years. The Pilbara isn't just a mine site, it's a choke point. And choke points historically don't stay uncontested forever. Drop your prediction in the comments. Which happens first, the infrastructure disclosure, the Simandou shipment, or the $120 ore spike? Tell me, because I read every single one. If this gave you a framework, a way of understanding the iron ore supply chain that connects weather events to steel prices to geopolitical repositioning, share it with one person who needs to understand what's actually moving beneath the surface of global commodity markets. The next video goes somewhere even this one didn't reach. Subscribe so you're there when it lands.